Sometimes you think you're making the smartest move of your life, only to realize you've just lit a match in a room full of gasoline. Anyway, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoy hearing about my messy life, and don't forget to subscribe. If you're new here, trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one. I'm Jenna, I'm 25, and 3 weeks ago, I thought I had everything figured out. Troy and I had been together almost 3 years, living together for 10 months in this decent apartment that he was covering most of the rent for while I got my career sorted. He worked some tech job that paid well enough for us to live comfortably, though between us, I always found his whole responsible provider thing kind of suffocating. Like, where was the excitement? The spontaneity? Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Troy was comfortable, safe. The kind of guy who had his life mapped out in spreadsheets and thought Friday night meant ordering takeout and watching Netflix. Sure, he was decent looking in that clean-cut gym-going way, but there was something so contained about him, like he'd never taken a real risk in his life, never done anything that made his heart race. That Monday night, when I dropped the "we need to talk" bomb, I genuinely believed I was being mature and self-aware. Babe, I've been thinking a lot lately, and I feel like we need a break. The look on his face, this mix of confusion and hurt, should have made me reconsider, but I was already mentally packing for Miami. My cousin had been posting these incredible stories from South Beach, and when she mentioned Bryce was living there now, well, let's just say my mental health break suddenly had a very specific destination in mind. Bryce. God, just thinking his name still did things to me that Troy never could. We dated in college, this intense, passionate thing that burned out when he graduated and moved away. But the chemistry we'd had was electric. Raw. Everything my relationship with Troy wasn't. Troy tried to be logical about it, asking about boundaries and what this meant, but I kept it vague on purpose. I mean, I wasn't technically planning to cheat, but I also wasn't about to tie my hands with a bunch of rules when I was finally going to see if there was still something between Bryce and me. The timing with Troy's birthday was unfortunate, sure, but this was about my personal growth. He'd understand eventually. What I didn't expect was how quickly he'd accept it. No fighting, no begging me to stay, just this cold, perfect timing then that pissed me off more than it should have. I wanted him to care more, to fight for us, but instead, he just let me go. It felt like validation that we really were stuck in a rut, that he was too weak to even fight for our relationship. The whole week leading up to my departure, I kept waiting for him to bring it up again, maybe suggest we work through whatever this was together. But he just went about his routine like nothing had changed. It was infuriating and liberating at the same time. Infuriating because it proved how little backbone he actually had. Liberating because it meant I could enjoy Miami guilt-free. When I left Wednesday morning, I gave him this casual goodbye like I was just going to work. Posted that self-care journey story from the airport because that's exactly what this was. Me finally prioritizing my own happiness instead of settling for some guy who couldn't even be bothered to fight for what we had. Miami was supposed to be my awakening, my chance to remember who I was before I got trapped in domestic routine with Troy. And for the first day, it felt exactly like that. The beach, the energy, the freedom. Everything Troy's structured, predictable world wasn't. When I saw Bryce at that beach club my cousin took me to, looking exactly like the guy I'd fallen for in college, but somehow, even better, I knew I'd made the right choice. But here's where things got complicated in ways I definitely didn't post about on Instagram. Bryce was different. Not in a bad way, just more mature, more settled. When I tried to recreate some of that old magic we used to have, he seemed almost uncomfortable. We hung out, took some great photos that definitely made Troy's pathetic life look boring by comparison. But every time I tried to push things further, Bryce would redirect the conversation or suggest we meet up with other people. By day 3, I was getting frustrated. Here I was having sacrificed my relationship and Troy's birthday for this moment, and Bryce was treating me like some casual friend. So I started being more direct, more flirty, making it clear what I wanted. That's when he dropped the bomb. He was seeing someone seriously. Had been for 8 months. All those photos I was posting of us together, he was just being polite because of my cousin. The humiliation was crushing, but I couldn't exactly post about that on social media. Instead, I doubled down on the finding myself narrative while internally spiraling. I'd blown up my stable relationship for a guy who wasn't even interested. But admitting that felt impossible, so I kept posting like I was having the time of my life, making sure Troy could see exactly what he was missing. What really stung was how Bryce started pulling back, even from the friendship stuff, after I made my intentions clear. Suddenly, he was busy when my cousin suggested group hangouts, and I found myself spending more time alone than I'd expected. The whole trip became this weird performance where I was documenting this amazing self-discovery journey while actually feeling more lost and rejected than ever. By the end of the week, I was ready to go home and fix things with Troy. Maybe this break had shown me that what we had was actually pretty good, even if it wasn't as exciting as I'd wanted. I started crafting this whole speech about how the time apart had given me clarity about us, how I was ready to appreciate what we had. I even picked up this expensive bottle of his favorite whiskey at the airport as a peace offering. The flight home, I was actually excited to see him. I'd learned my lesson about taking good things for granted, and I was ready to put real effort into making our relationship work. I texted him that I was landing at 3 and couldn't wait to see him and talk about us. His response, just okay, seemed a little cold, but I figured he was probably just protecting himself after how I'd left things. Walking into our apartment that Friday afternoon, I felt like I was returning from some transformative journey, ready to be a better girlfriend. I had my whole speech planned about how Miami had shown me what really mattered, how I was ready to stop taking Troy for granted and build something real together. The expensive whiskey was in my bag along with this vintage band t-shirt I'd found that I knew he'd love. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The apartment was too clean, like he'd been deep cleaning or something. And there was this energy, not angry exactly, but different. Troy was working at his laptop, and when he looked up at me, his expression was neutral. Not hurt, not excited, just completely unreadable. "Baby, I'm back," I said, going for that warm, intimate tone that usually worked on him. But when I moved to kiss him, he turned his head slightly, so I got his cheek instead of his lips. That stung, but I told myself he was just being cautious after how I'd left things. I started launching into my prepared speech about how incredible Miami was and how much clarity I'd gained about us, but he seemed distracted, barely responding. It was like talking to a wall. Finally, I asked what was wrong, and he just said, "We're on a break, remember?" in this flat tone that made my stomach drop. That's when I heard the shower running. My first thought was that he'd had some friend over, maybe Grady, helping him with something. But then the bathroom door opened and Caitlin walked out wearing one of Troy's shirts, her hair in this effortless, messy bun that somehow looked perfect on her. The world just stopped. Caitlin, my best friend since college, the girl who'd listened to me complain about Troy for months, who'd helped me plan this whole Miami trip, was standing in my apartment wearing my boyfriend's clothes like she belonged there. "Hey, Jenna," she said like this was the most normal thing in the world. "How was Miami? How's Bryce?" And there was something in her tone, this knowing smugness, that made me realize she'd known exactly what I was doing down there. The rage that hit me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. This wasn't just betrayal. This was calculated, planned betrayal. While I was in Miami trying to figure out my life, my best friend had swooped in and stolen my boyfriend. The boyfriend I'd been planning to come home and fight for. What the hell is this? I managed to get out, but my voice sounded weak and shaky instead of the righteous anger I was feeling. "We were on a break," Troy said, echoing my own words back to me. "Your rules." The next few minutes were a blur of accusations and revelations that completely shattered my understanding of the situation. Caitlin, standing there in Troy's shirt like she owned the place, had the audacity to act like I was the one being unreasonable. "You left him alone on his birthday to chase after your ex," she said, and hearing it put so bluntly made me want to slap her. Someone had to make sure he wasn't sitting home feeling sorry for himself. But it was Troy's response that really cut deep. She told me about the texts, Jenna, the ones you thought you'd deleted. My stomach dropped. Caitlin had seen the messages between Bryce and me, had known exactly what I was planning before I even left. You've been planning this Miami thing for weeks. Troy continued, his voice still maddeningly calm. Caitlin showed me the screenshots. You weren't going there to find yourself. You were going there to see if you could get your ex back. The betrayal I felt was overwhelming, but not just from them. From myself, for being so careless with my phone around Caitlin. She'd been playing the supportive best friend while documenting my emotional affair, probably planning this whole thing. That's different. I said, though, even as the words came out, I knew how weak they sounded. I didn't actually do anything with Bryce. Because he rejected you, Caitlin said, with this little smile that made me want to scream. I saw those last few texts you sent him. Pretty desperate stuff. The humiliation was crushing. Not only had my Miami plan failed spectacularly, but now my best friend and boyfriend knew every pathetic detail. They'd probably been laughing about it together while I was down there making a fool of myself. How long has this been going on? I demanded, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Since your birthday, Troy said. You know, the one you missed for your self-care journey. The way he said it with those air quotes made me realize how transparent my whole plan had been. They'd seen right through me from the beginning, and instead of calling me out or fighting for our relationship, Troy had just moved on with my best friend. 3 years, I said, my voice breaking. 3 years down the drain. You drained them yourself when you booked that flight, Caitlin replied, and the casual cruelty of it took my breath away. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in how quickly your entire life can implode when people decide they're done with your drama. I moved in with my friend Noah, temporarily spending my days alternating between rage and this desperate need to make Troy understand that what we had was worth fighting for. My first instinct was to launch a full social media campaign about betrayal and fake friends, but every post I made just seemed to backfire. People who'd seen my Miami photos with Bryce weren't buying my victim narrative, and when Caitlin posted that simple message about when someone leaves you for their ex, don't be surprised when you find someone better, the comment section became a battlefield where I was clearly losing. I tried calling our mutual friends, but the conversations were awkward and uncomfortable. Everyone had seen the Miami posts, and when I tried to explain that nothing had actually happened with Bryce, it just made me sound more pathetic. Grady, who I'd always thought was more Troy's friend than mine, was brutally direct. You really thought you were slick, but everyone could see what you were doing. The worst part was how happy they looked together. When I drove by our old apartment building, I'd see them walking to the coffee shop we used to go to or loading groceries into Troy's car like they were playing house with my life. Caitlin fit into my old routine so seamlessly it was like I'd never existed. I started showing up places I knew they'd be, not to cause drama, but just to remind Troy of what we'd had together. The grocery store where we used to shop, the restaurant where we'd had our first date. But every encounter just made me look more desperate and unhinged. The breaking point came when I saw them at the farmer's market we used to go to every Sunday. They were laughing about something, Troy's arm around her waist in that casual, comfortable way that used to be ours. When they saw me, instead of looking guilty or uncomfortable, they just waved, like I was some acquaintance they were being polite to. That's when I realized they weren't just dating. They were building a whole life together in the space I'd vacated. And the worst part was how natural it looked, how right they seemed together in a way that Troy and I maybe never had. The megaphone incident wasn't planned. It was pure desperation mixed with wine and the kind of rage that makes you do things you can't take back. I'd been sitting in my car outside their apartment building for an hour, watching their windows when I saw them cooking dinner together. The domestic intimacy of it, the way Caitlin moved around what used to be my kitchen, like she belonged there, finally broke something in me. I bought the megaphone at a sporting goods store along with poster board and markers. If they wanted to play house with my life, fine, but everyone was going to know exactly what kind of people they were. Cheaters live here, felt like the truth I needed to broadcast to the world. Standing on that sidewalk with the megaphone shouting about betrayal and fake friends, I felt powerful for the first time in weeks. Finally, I was controlling the narrative instead of being the victim of it. But when the neighbors started coming out, when Mrs. Patterson yelled back about my Miami trip, when someone compared me to Ross from Friends, the power I'd felt started crumbling into humiliation. The cops were almost a relief when they showed up. At least they treated the situation seriously, even if they sided with Troy and Caitlin in the end. The warning they gave me felt like the final nail in the coffin of any dignity I had left. But the real consequences were just beginning. The video someone took of my megaphone meltdown went viral in our social circle and then somehow made its way to my workplace. Getting fired for conduct unbecoming was devastating, but not as devastating as realizing that everyone, coworkers, friends, family, saw me as the crazy ex-girlfriend who couldn't handle rejection. The cease and desist letter from Bryce's girlfriend was the final humiliation. Learning that he'd been rejecting my advances for months, that his girlfriend had screenshots of my desperate texts, that even my Miami triumph had been a complete delusion. It shattered the last of my self-deception. Moving back in with my parents at 25 felt like admitting defeat, but I had no choice. My savings were gone, my job was gone, my friends had chosen sides, and I was the one left with nothing. The worst part was seeing Troy and Caitlin and my Nyland's relationship continue to flourish while my life fell apart. They looked genuinely happy together in a way that made me question if Troy and I had ever really had what I thought we did. It's been 2 months now since everything imploded, and I'm still picking up the pieces. Sitting in my childhood bedroom, scrolling through their social media posts about date nights and weekend trips, I finally had to face the truth. I destroyed a good relationship chasing a fantasy, and in doing so, I'd lost everything that actually mattered. The break I'd demanded had become permanent, but not in any way I could have imagined. Fine. Maybe I made some mistakes. Maybe I shouldn't have gone to Miami, shouldn't have chased after Bryce like some desperate teenager. But Troy, he gave up on us so easily. 3 years together, and he couldn't even fight for what we had. What kind of man does that? And Caitlin, she was supposed to be my friend. She knew how confused I was, how lost I felt. And instead of helping me figure things out, she swooped in the second I was gone. They got their happy ending, and I got exactly what I deserved. Nothing. But at least now I know what kind of people they really are. Weak, opportunistic, selfish. They deserve each other.